Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us both in person and online for today's book launch of Global Approaches to the Holocaust. Before we go any further, for those of you who are here in person, please turn off your cell phones and anything else that may make noise during the program. We hope that if you do not get a chance to today, that you will come back and see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which is opening on December 7th. We also hope you will join us for our upcoming programs, especially the 2025 New York Jewish Book Festival, which is happening next weekend on Sunday, November 16th. And you can learn more about both of those on the museum's website. Today, we are honored to be joined by Minaj Afridi, Mark Selenzak, did I say it correctly? Yes, and Laura B. Cohen. Minaj is professor of religion and philosophy and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University. Mark is the Lewis and Francis Blumkin Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the executive director of the Sam and Francis Fried Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Laura is the executive director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. There will be a Q&A at the end of the program, so please save your questions for that time. You can purchase Global Approaches to the Holocaust on the first floor, and Minaj and Mark will be signing books after the event in the first floor lobby. So thank you so much again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, Sydney. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Laura Cohen, and thank you for joining us today in person and online at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, for the launch of the book Global Approaches to the Holocaust, Memory, History, and Representation, featuring my colleagues and co-editors, Dr. Mark Selenzak and Dr. Minaj Afridi. Today is also the 87th anniversary of the November 1938 pogroms, known as Kristallnacht, making this event even more poignant and pressing. Through case studies from numerous countries around the world, the authors in Global Approaches to the Holocaust ask, what happens when scholars shift their focus from an exclusively European perspective of the Holocaust? What insights are gained from exploring the impact of the Holocaust from outside the European milieu? How do countries that were not directly affected by Nazi policies of occupation and extermination remember the Holocaust? And what does an expansive approach to the Holocaust entail? Now, please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers. And you've heard the centers that they represent, but I'll repeat them again. Dr. Mark Selenzak is the Lewis and Francis Blumkin Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Executive Director of the Sam and Francis Fried Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He's the author of Kingdom of Night, Witnesses to the Holocaust, and Distance from the Bergen Heap, Allied Forces and the Liberation of a Nazi Concentration Camp. And Dr. Minaj Afridi is Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University. She's the author of Shoah Through Muslim Eyes and the forthcoming book, The Wounded Muslim, Memory and Tragedy, coming out on Bloomsbury Press next year. The three of us also sit on the executive committee for the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, which is how I got to know them. And I've had a good fortune to collaborate with both of you. I consider you both mentors as well. And it's an honor to be here today to moderate the discussion. So without further ado, let's ask some questions. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of this book and how you decided on which scholars to reach out to and which regions to feature?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Cohen. And before I begin, I just want to thank the museum for hosting us. It means a lot to us that we're having this launch. It's such an esteemed institute, so thank you very much for that. I want to thank Dr. Cohen for agreeing to be our moderator. It means a great deal as well that you agreed to moderate this talk. And of course, to thank all of you for coming out on a very, very rainy Sunday afternoon. So that is very appreciative. This book is part of a series called Contemporary Holocaust Studies series, published by the University of Nebraska Press. The series editors are Dr. Gerald Steinacker and Dr. Ari Cohen. Both of them are professors at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. When I arrived in Omaha from Toronto in 2016, they invited me to be part of a symposium on rescue and the Holocaust. So it was very privileged to be part of that symposium. The speakers of that symposium and the work that was done in that symposium became the foundation for the first book in the series about rescue and the Holocaust. Subsequently, they published another collection of essays on anti-Semitism from the 1930s to the present day. So they were acting both as series editors, but also editors of both of those books. So for volume number 3, they asked me if I would like to edit the third volume. Of course, I was very, very flattered. They pretty much put no limits on me. Whatever topic I thought, if I wanted to co-edit with someone, 3 editors, 4 editors, they basically said, have your pick. And so I gave it some thought, and it was pretty clear who I wanted to work with. I've known Dr. Manaz Afridi now for about 15 years. I think we've known each other quite some time. I hold her in the absolute highest regard as a scholar, as a human being, and I'm very, very fortunate to call her a friend. So I thought to myself, I can not only work with a first-rate scholar, but also with a very, very dear friend. And so I pitched the idea that we would work together. The idea involved absolutely nothing. I had no topic in mind. I had no conceptualization of what we would do. And I'll leave it to her to explain why she agreed and how we came to the topic.
Wow. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the museum. Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to go with first names, no doctors here. And thank you all for coming. And some of my students are here, so big hurrah for you guys to come out in this rain and come to something that maybe is a little different, right? Different scene and scenario. So I wanted, I almost felt like crying when you said that you wanted to work with me and how you hold me in high esteem. But I feel very much the same about Mark. I admire him, and I wrote to him yesterday, I adore you, don't worry. So it's, academics don't always fight. I just want to make that clear. We actually get along and care about one another. But when Mark came to me and said, hey, we've got an opportunity, Mehnaz, and I was like, oh, I know exactly what I want to do. And he goes, you do? I said, yeah, I want to do, and at that time, I called it International Approaches to the Holocaust. And our editors kind of wanted us to go with global, so we changed the international to global, which is fine. And he said, well, oh, cool, right? And then he started brainstorming with me, and that's how the idea came. And the reason for this idea was that my approaches usually are very global. Students here know that. My colleagues know that, my family knows that, but I also really wanted to expand Holocaust education all over. And I wanted more people to be interested in stories from Chile or Morocco or Pakistan or India, because I feel that sometimes the Holocaust is framed in a particular European lens. And that alienates a lot of people, in a sense, right? So I wanted to have diverse people educating themselves about perhaps their own country and how the Holocaust was related, like in Japan, right? And how did Jews get to Japan? And what did they do? And how were they represented? And how do we see this identity? And what is present-day education doing about Jews, Judaism, and the Holocaust? So that's really was my impetus, and it's still my passion in terms of teaching the Holocaust.
And if I can just add to that, so it would have been probably strange for us to work on a book where one of us wasn't sort of represented. And I think Manaz saw an interesting connection, because I have a background in military history. That's sort of how I came to Holocaust studies, through the subject of liberation. Manaz focuses on religion, the Muslim and Arab worlds and things like that. But we both approached the Holocaust from very unique vantage points. I'd say maybe non-traditional vantage points, right? My first 2 books bring in Canada and the UK, and to an extent America, in terms of liberation of a Nazi concentration camp, right? Manaz with her connections to the Muslim and Arab worlds. So we were both kind of doing global type work in our research, and in terms of how we selected these wonderful authors, and I know a lot of them are actually tuned in right now to watch. I think for the both of us, we had kind of 2 criteria. There's all these wonderful scholars that are doing work that is contributing to Holocaust studies, whether it's about North Africa, South Africa, Japan, China, Latin America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to find these scholars who are breaking new ground and making contributions to Holocaust studies and kind of house them in this collection. And then I think the second criteria, at least certainly from my perspective, was how global can we get? I really wanted to try to kind of span the entire globe, because I think when we really started looking, we found scholars, doing really interesting work on Japan and the Holocaust, Mauritius and the Holocaust, South Africa and the Holocaust, right? Mexico and the Holocaust. And they're really doing interesting work, and so we're very, very proud to have them as part of this book.
It's really helpful to hear you talk about the global approach, and I think so often, sometimes especially depending on the kind of center that we're at, the focus might either be more narrow or broader depending on the audience. And so I just want to build on that and ask you both, can you explain how the field of Holocaust studies has shifted over time and the challenges of defining the Holocaust? For example, when we think about its memory and impact, what are some temporal, chronological, spatial, and geographic considerations? All academic terms. So what does that actually mean? Means, for example, what time periods are we referring to? What countries and places should we include? In addition to survivors, victims, and perpetrators we've long focused on, who else does this history include?
Sure, yeah. I think, and I don't want to go over the entire field of Holocaust studies, because it has changed a great deal over the decades. If you go back to the 60s and 70s and you look at those early pioneers like Raoul Hilberg, Hannah Arendt, et cetera, they were largely focused on regimes, totalitarianism, all right, the Nazi Germany, et cetera. I don't know if you would have asked them in the 60s if they would have even identified as Holocaust scholars. At some point maybe yes, but maybe not in those early days. And then of course when the field explodes in the 1980s, it takes on its continental European dimensions, and in particular Eastern Europe becomes a very, very large focus, and I think Hilberg called it the triad, the survivor, perpetrator, bystander focus, and I think these are really, really important. As we move into the 90s, into the 2000s, I think one really important step was approaching the Holocaust within the context of the Second World War. Right? I mean, obviously the Second World War is this global conflict, and I think Doris Bergen once said, no war, no Holocaust. Hitler was fighting two wars, not only a war against the Allies, but also a war against the Jews. And as you situate the Holocaust within this global conflict, I think you start seeing those global dimensions, and I think it becomes really, really important. So I think this book really calls into question or causes people to maybe reflect on definitions, on geography, on chronology. Is the Holocaust not European Gentiles killing European Jews? I think that is a definition of the Holocaust, but maybe where do the Roma fit in that kind of definition, right? What about the first people targeted, the disabled, those with mental illnesses? We can go further, gay men. How do they fit in that kind of a definition? As an educator in the classroom, I often start with how we conceptualize any topic. So when did the Holocaust begin? Is it 1941 when large-scale killing begins? Maybe it's 1939, start of the Second World War in Europe? Maybe we can go back to 1935 with the Nuremberg Laws. Do we maybe go back to 1933 when Hitler comes to power? Hitler didn't appear out of nowhere, so maybe we roll it back into the early 20s. Maybe we go back to the end of the First World War. And keeping in that line of thinking, when does the Holocaust end? I think the most obvious date would be 1945. But then how do we place the pogroms that happened in 1946, right? And also, what constitutes Holocaust studies? I have colleagues who focus on life in the displaced persons camps post-war, right? And they often feel like that they're sort of on the outside looking in, that they're not really considered scholars of the Holocaust. I certainly would consider them, but some of those camps remained open until 1952, right? So maybe that is a way we can conceptualize. And then in terms of geography, and I'm sorry, I think I'm monopolizing this answer. In terms of geography, we have a preeminent museum in Washington, D.C. to study the Holocaust. There were articles in the 1990s is why is there a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C. or in New York City, right? Why are there museums of study and memorials and remembrance in Japan, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, et cetera? So remembrance of the Holocaust is also certainly global as well. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I have a totally, I agree with what you said, Mark, but I have a totally different take on that. I think Holocaust studies has really changed a lot. And it's changed because we have had other genocides since 1945 that have been recognized, some not, some have, and it's shifted, right? So now we talk about Holocaust and genocide studies. I also think that that has also shifted the idea of genocide, period, right? It's moved the needle in a way where we experience genocide, watch it on TV, and we don't really think about the post-trauma and the memory that is going to happen and unfold. That's one way that things have changed in terms of the field. I think also Holocaust studies was more of a historian-based discipline. I'm in religious studies. My training is in religious studies. I know anthropologists that are in our book, like Omar Bohm. I know sociologists that wrote in our book. I think it's expanded in terms of what frame and approach we take in Holocaust studies. We've also expanded to literature and Holocaust, narrative, fiction, historical fiction, which I've actually written about the Holocaust. So I think there's a lot of differences in terms of Holocaust. The second element, which is probably the most dangerous thing, is that there is a lot of Holocaust distortion and denial today that we have not seen. It's huge, and it's very big online, and I think that is a very big problem for Holocaust scholars. It also is a very big problem for scholars or teachers that are trying to teach the Holocaust. So social media and also lies and new podcasts that are relativizing history, like someone like Hitler, have become very popular with people. And I think that is the danger of Holocaust studies. So I wanted to say that there's one, that the field has shifted in terms of interdisciplinary mode. The second point is that we have a problem in Holocaust studies, and we need to address that. And we are trying to address it in this book, I hope.
And I think you bring up some really interesting points, which is the different ways that people interact with Holocaust history, Holocaust memory, Holocaust representation. So let's build on that a little. An important discussion also concerns our expectations from Holocaust education, especially as we witness the troubling rise of anti-Semitism, as well as the ongoing discrimination and violence against communities around the world. And something we talk about a lot at our center is the need to learn from the Holocaust, but also about the Holocaust. The past is in constant conversation with the present. So I'm thinking about, as we think about the Holocaust history and implications for our current society now, as well as the promotion of democracy and rule of law around the world, which is fraying in many places, why is a global approach to Holocaust education so important?
Thank you, Laura. That's a great question. And it's important because, actually my second point that I just made, but also because I think, I'm also very concerned with anti-Semitism. I'm a Muslim, and I live in many Muslim communities, and I see it all the time. And it was a problem for me when I wrote my first book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, because as a Muslim, Islamic principles tell you not to deny someone's pain or suffering or existence. And I was raised as a Muslim with Islamic principles of peace and unity with Jews, Christians, etc. So that's one of the battles I have personally, but also in terms of ethics. Why that has any connection to the global is because there is a lot of anti-Semitism globally, not just in the United States, not just with the white Christian right. it's everywhere, right? And it's coming from communities that have never met a Jew, never talked to a Jew, or never heard of the Holocaust. This book actually addresses that. It addresses it in a way that a student in Argentina can read about their history with Jews. It addresses it in a way that a student in Palestine can read about what is the state of education in Palestine. It addresses it so that in Morocco, you can think about a time when Jewish Arabs and Muslim Arabs wrote songs together and talked about the premonition of the Vichy coming, mainly the Nazis, in the 1930s to the 40s. So, I mean, what we're doing is we're bringing this together to an audience, a global audience, global students, and further research to look at how do these countries, these cultures react to the idea of the Jew, right? So it has to do with anti-Semitism, and it has to do with global education.
That was very, very well said. I think it should be evident by now why I asked Manaz to work with me on this this book. So I think that the global approach, I think it just demonstrates how connected we all are, right? To use an example, I think many of us in the room will be familiar with the MS St. Louis, right? We have European Jews, largely German Jews, aboard the MS St. Louis. It arrives in Cuba, it's turned away. Arrives in the United States, it's turned away. Arrives in Canada, it's turned away. And then it's sent back to Europe, and it implicates the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, I believe, France. And many of the Jews aboard end up being killed in extermination camps in Poland, right? So there you have multiple continents, a number of different countries involved, and global conflicts, crimes under occupation, refugee policies. I think these sort of things impact us all, whether it's directly or indirectly. And I think this is something that's still very much going on today, right? So I think that global approach, I think, hopefully will resonate even more today with audiences.
I just want to add something. I mean, this also has very much to do with my work on Islamophobia, which we are experiencing in a very high level today. And why it has to do with anything with it is that in the book you'll read about Jews arriving to these different countries and the perception of Jews, right, as immigrants. And it's actually not so dissimilar about what's going on in Western Europe and the United States with looking at the immigrant, right, the brown immigrant, and especially the Muslim. Right now in Sudan, there's a genocide going on, and there's a displacement of over 2 million people that are going to have to leave and go places. So I think that these things are connected. They're not disconnected. So just because it's about the Holocaust, it doesn't mean we can't learn the lessons from the Holocaust, which is what I think we've forgotten. We always say, never again, but never again what, right? And that is super important in education, but also important when we start thinking about, I mean, I'm looking at, Statue of Liberty, and I'm asking myself, well, is this really representative of our lives today, right? And what do we do with North African immigrants that are in places like France and Italy and Germany that are trying to just escape, right? And to build a life in these places, just like the Jews were. They were escaping persecution, death, right? This is not a joke. And that's why they were trying to get to every shore possible that they could. And so I think that's super important to me as a Muslim representative, a Holocaust scholar, but also somebody who is in religious studies. Sorry, thank you.
No, I think that really resonates with the work that we do at the center, and I want to just point out we all run university centers on very different campuses. We all have different personal identities, and one of the struggles that we have at our center is students who come in and may not be that familiar with it, or they've heard about it, but they don't understand why they should care. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the opposite of this, which is there are people right now, the field is kind of split. There's always been these tensions, but one is, do we focus on the Holocaust, exclusively what happened to European Jewry? Or do we also talk about the other different groups of people who were also targeted? And this is a really important thing. So one of the concerns is if we continue to talk about all of the different groups, that we're diminishing what happens. And how does this also then connect to how we understand anti-Semitism? So I guess the question is, how do we get students and other people to care about this in a way that also recognizes that, again, I will continually come back and say it, the past is in conversation with the present?
Okay, feel free to cut me off. Well, let me begin by answering this question by paraphrasing my co-editor, who we spoke to Gratz College, students at Gratz College, maybe a couple weeks ago now, as I recall. And Manaz said something that I thought was extremely profound in our discussions about this very question, actually. She said something, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so feel free to correct me. She said that if we want Holocaust education to reach areas where it is not studied, or or places where it has been forgotten or ignored, then it can help if we can include those areas and those individuals and people in the story as well. Easier said than done, of course, but a global approach gets you there. So I'm going to call an example from my own research. Doesn't feature in the book, but there was an American liberator named Fred Roberts Crawford from San Antonio, Texas. He confronted Holocaust denial by interviewing U.S. veterans who liberated Nazi camps. And this came about in the 1970s when the Holocaust miniseries aired on American television. He was stunned to find out that the local affiliate was inundated with calls denying what they were being shown in that miniseries. And so he got together with fellow veterans, began interviewing those who were involved in the liberation of Nazi camps. He called it the Witnesses to the Holocaust Project. It was based in Emory University. Fred Roberts Crawford eventually got a PhD. He was a professor of sociology there. And what he found was that in part, this also became, in small part, became an American story too. And what his conclusion was that when people can relate to the story, whether it's to relate to the witness, relate to the speaker, whether it's someone they can identify with, it could be a brother, a cousin, a veteran, et cetera, they're more likely to engage and believe with what is being told. So it was called the Witness to the Holocaust Project at Emory University, and I think it was just an example of I think it reflects a little bit on our approach of the book by telling this worldwide global story of the Holocaust, whether it's through memory, through history, through representation. And I think it can engage very diverse audiences. So I thought that was very profound when you brought that up, because I think it was there, but I hadn't really conceptualized it until you said it in that way.
Thank you, Mark. I don't really remember what I said at that thing, but I'm sure you were right on. I wanted to say, I think also, Laura, you're asking the question of something that I think a lot of Jews and Holocaust educators are concerned about, which is watering down the Holocaust, right? And let's just say it, right? This is what people are concerned with. Well, I don't do that. But I do want us to think about and engage with this idea of watering down the Holocaust. What does that mean? I think for people, it means that it's on the forefront. It is kind of relativized in terms of other genocides. I mean, I have written in my first book openly that Holocaust is unprecedented. Not unique, but unprecedented. And the reason that I made that statement, it was actually a statement that Yehuda Bauer made many years ago in his own work on the Holocaust, is because there was no genocide, and there is no genocide right now, that is actually going to other countries and subjugating, say, Muslims or Jews or Africans, right? If you look at Bosnia, there was the ethnic cleansing or the genocide of Muslims, but they didn't move to Albania and start killing Albanian Muslims. That was not the case in the Holocaust, right? So I would argue that it's unprecedented. It's still in the forefront of my work. I teach a class, some of you are in it, Muslims in the Holocaust. And we are doing North Africa, and we're talking about Jewish Arabs and Muslim Arabs. And I think the second fold of your question is even more important. Just because you are learning the lessons of the Holocaust and accepting the suffering of 6 million Jews and others does not mean that you can't learn from that experience and apply it in other ways. I mean, your suffering is as important as the other person's suffering. There's no competition, and why would you want to compete and have a deeper suffering? That's crazy, right? So the whole point of teaching Holocaust is not to water it down, but to make your students understand what this was about. This was a state-sanctioned murder. And if you hear that, it's scary. It was a state-sanctioned murder against Jews because they were Jews. Not because they were fighting anybody, not because they had a bomb threat. They were Jews, period. So their suffering was different, yes. But your suffering, whether you are talking about Bosnia or Sudan or even Palestine, is as important. It's just different. But if you can't acknowledge that, whether Jew, Muslim, black, white, brown, then there's no conversation. And so when we talk about watering down, that's what I mean by watering down, is when you stop to recognize what is unprecedented about the Holocaust.
I think it's really important to reiterate that, we want people to care about this. We want people to care about other suffering that's going on in the world. And I think that that's also really critical for students as a way to understand these lessons, because we always think lessons mean tragedy, but lessons can also mean opportunity. It can mean robbing people. It can mean scapegoating people. I mean, there's really tremendous ways to conceptualize the kind of suffering and opportunism that goes on during the war against Jewish people, but against lots of other groups. So let's talk about a few themes that are in the book. And two themes that really stood out are, one, experiences of Jewish people in these different countries and how the memory and the aftermath of the Holocaust manifests there. And then you have another theme that centers on the impact of the Holocaust memory within countries and groups and communities with no direct connection to it. Can you talk a little bit about this dichotomy?
I'm glad you picked up on that. It's a critically important theme in the book. So Jewish refugees, the lack of immigration opportunities is a major part of the story. And I think I'd like to also call our attention to some of the great work that appears in the book. So I'll give one example. Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, who's at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, wrote a really important chapter on the Fort Ontario refugee shelter. I believe that's the subject of her next book, so we got a little bit of a preview in this book. So for those of you who don't know, that is the only wartime refugee shelter on U.S. soil, right? It held nearly 1,000 refugees, primarily Jews, and what I think it does, at least what this chapter does from my perspective, is it provides, I think, really important insight on refugee admission. This is
and
still,
it's in New York, upstate.
Yes,
you can
absolutely.
Go see it.
Yeah, and I think quite clearly, this is still a major topic for us today. I wrote an epilogue on an individual named Charles K. Bliss, who's just an absolutely fascinating man. He created his own language called Bliss symbols, semotography. He was an Austrian Jew who saw action in the First World War, served as a medic, so saw the violence of the war firsthand. Post-war, went to university, got a degree, and when the Nazis came to power and absorbed Austria, he was detained in both Dachau and Buchenwald. His wife, who is a Roman Catholic, was able to secure his release, and from Austria and Germany, he made his way to England. And in England, he tried to get his wife, who he feared would be also persecuted from her for her efforts, to eventually get her to Shanghai, where they had some distant relatives. From England, Bliss ends up going to Canada, takes a ship across the Atlantic, ends up in Canada, tries to find a way as a refugee to stay in Canada, to secure his immigration status. He fails at that, unable to do it. The Canadian government would not permit his residency. Goes all the way across the giant country of Canada to the west coast and takes a ship, ends up in Japan, and then on to China, where he is basically in Shanghai and then eventually interned in the Shanghai ghetto. Post-war, he ends up in Australia. One individual in search of safety, in search of protection, ends up in multiple continents, a range of countries, and is unable to find security anywhere he looked. So this is one of those examples of a Jewish refugee in search of safety, in search of protection, and just his story alone, this is why I was glad we were able to include the story in the epilogue, shows him alone the global dimensions of the Holocaust, whether directly or indirectly implicating all these different countries, right? Whether it's England, Canada, Japan, Australia, etc. I think it shows that kind of dimension of, and how is Bliss, perceived? How is he remembered? I think is an important aspect of what we're trying to achieve in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of the chapter on Mauritius and how the ship was like, what was it called? The milieu, I think, or it was not allowed, the Jews were not allowed to disembark, but then there were some Jews that came back on the ship and they were allowed to disembark. So it was really interesting that, an island would take in Jews. And if you read that chapter, it talks about how the island was welcoming to Jews because they could relate to them because they had been under colonization. Like Mauritius went through a lot, right, with Africa, the British, the French. I mean, it was like changing all the time and finally became independent. So there was a relational sort of mindset to help Jews, right? So even the idea of colonization, when we talk about it, and we talk about it a lot in my Muslims in the Holocaust class, is that there was this sort of idea that you were subhuman, right, even during colonization. So these chapters kind of bring you back to the historical mapping of the world. And I want my students so desperately to know more about the map, just the world map, period, right? I'm not even talking about thinking about anything else, but to know where these continents are and how people got there and what is an island and what is not an island. It's a marvelous world, right? It's global. So when you start to understand where things are, or understand a little bit of language, like in North Africa, or, well, how do we get Tripoli, the name, in Libya? Well, the Italians were there. Tripoli, right? Or how is it possible that people in Morocco speak French and Arabic? Well, the French were there for a long time, right? So these are really good questions to kind of understand the different multitude identities that we all come with, not just one, but multiple. And this is that global approach that we're giving and offering to students, educators, and to all of you to kind of delve into these different areas of the world that become the fabric of so much refugee history. And again, we're in the 21st century and we are going through a global refugee problem today. And we're gonna see more and more of this. So students, prepare yourself for the next 20-some years. This is important to know in your future, no matter what you do in your life.
While the world is a much, much larger place than it was in the 30s and 40s, there are more refugees today than ever in human history. Yeah.
I've been reflecting on that a lot as students come in and we think about what is happening with ICE, and we think about people being shipped off to places, and we think about the different groups of people who are being targeted now and how these processes unfold. And it's not to say that things from the past are happening exactly as they did back then, but there are connections, and I think it's really important for us to see these. And when we start to look at, for our students, using the Holocaust as a window to see what happened to people and where individuals can speak up and why education is so important, I think that's really, really critical, so that we start to recognize and really reinforce all forms of discrimination and hate are connected. Absolutely, anti-Semitism is connected to Islamophobia, anti-Asian violence, racism, and so forth. And so as we're wrapping up, and I'm just looking at the time a little bit, so there are many, many really powerful case studies in the book, from Australia, Canada, Argentina, Mexico, Pakistan, New Zealand, Chile, South Africa, Morocco, Japan, and more. What are some of the case studies that really stood out to you, and why?
All right. Well, I certainly, I mean, I got love for all of our authors. So all the chapters are excellent. And I certainly knew of their work before, otherwise we wouldn't have invited them. But working with Rand Zwigenberg and Rotem Kauner, who wrote on Japan and the Holocaust, I became so fascinated, not just by the chapter they submitted, which is a first-rate chapter, but their larger work. They have these fascinating articles and books on Japan and the Holocaust. And in the chapter that is featured in the book, they look at how the Japanese have made a connection between Hiroshima and Nagasaki and a site like Auschwitz, for example. There are some in Japan who view them as two Holocausts. And it has become a way for them to relate their own trauma as being the first victim of the atomic bomb, while at the same time excusing their own wartime crimes. So it becomes a very, very complicated subject. And I think they do an unbelievable job in this chapter. And while it's not covered in this specific chapter, they also have work, especially Zwigenberg, on Anne Frank. Anne Frank and the Japanese interest in Anne Frank. My wife is Japanese. I have a half Japanese daughter, so I obviously clearly have an interest in Japan as a subject, despite not being a specialist. And Anne Frank was translated into Japanese in I believe it was 1952. It was very, very early translation. And in translation in Japanese, according to the research that has been done, it's more of a coming-of-age story during the war. Anne Frank's Jewishness, in many ways, has been removed from that story. And again, it is a way for the Japanese to connect their own traumas of having the atomic bomb dropped on them to make a connection with this symbol of the Holocaust. It's absolutely fascinating the way her image and her symbol has been manipulated for other means. And so that was one of the chapters that really drew me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm going to read you something. This is from my friend Omar Boum. He's a Moroccan anthropologist, a wonderful scholar at UCLA. And so he writes this lyric of a song, and I'll just read it. In the name of God, we start. We waited for the arrival of Germans. Instead, the Americans appeared. The Germans erred and regretted. The Americans now rule. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Sunday when it started. Casablanca is a war zone. Safi and Azuria are full of pain. And by afternoon, France has a new government. Did you see that Vichy put down its arms for its own sake? So this was at the time of the liberation of Morocco and Algeria by the Americans, which was in 1942. And it was an occasion, he says, for indigenous Jews and Muslims to express their feelings and attitudes about the ongoing war. You never see that together, indigenous Jews and Muslims. And guess what? They were in their own country, right? Both of them. So I think those things really draw you to a different way and perspective and language of thinking about this history. And it takes you away from the European gaze. For a long time, I felt the Holocaust studies and genocide studies was kind of ruled by, sorry, Mark, white males. And that was fine. They're my friends, they're my colleagues. But at the same time, it was like, where are the other voices? Where are the voices of women? I have a friend here, Marisa, whose film is about her mother and women and rape and slave labor camps. I have a friend here from Pakistan, Hina Ali, who did a film about Jews from Pakistan. These voices were kind of left out of this bigger narrative. And those voices are the ones that kind of knock on us, right? And say, don't forget about me. I was there, and I was 50% of it. So I think that to me, is so part of this book. And, there are women who've written who are marginal and men who are not marginal. So it's a very diverse authorship of global approaches of the Holocaust. So that's how I would answer it.
Thank you both. It's really powerful to hear you articulate all of these different themes and sort of the moment that Holocaust studies finds ourselves in. So I wanted to turn it over to all of you to see if you have any questions for Manaz and Mark.
And if you could wait for the mic to come around before you start speaking. Okay.
In some of the colleges, has the cutbacks in the educational piece from the government and their concerns, the U.S. government, has it affected funding on research on the globalization of Holocaust studies?
You're speaking to three people who are very privileged to be directors of centers that can specialize on the Holocaust. So that is the generosity of private endowments. It's certainly in my case, I think, in the case of both of my colleagues. So we're able within the center to continue our programming and our research in Holocaust studies. I am concerned of cutbacks to general education and what we, especially in the public sector and public universities. I think it's early, but I think it's going to have a profound impact, unfortunately. But I'm also grateful that we have very generous donors who have allowed us to continue to do our research and to do our programming, so that we're able to explore subjects like this one.
Yeah, I mean, Brother Jim, I'm at Manhattan University, which is a Catholic institution, and they have been very supportive. I have a very small budget, but I make it happen. And I have a lot of really good friends in different fields that come and say, okay, we'll do this for you, Manaz. But I also say that what I think the question should be is how Holocaust studies, genocide studies, anti-Semitism, and Islamic programs are controversial. All four of those. And there are colleagues of mine that are Jewish that have been fired, vice versa, Muslim been fired. So there is the thing that I worry the most is about freedom of speech and institutional money and private donations and who controls that in terms of your voice. So that's a concern. Manhattan University has done really quite well. We have had peace prayers. We have really created interfaith dialogues, and we constantly have programming at the university. So I have to say that as a Catholic institution, I'm very lucky, very grateful to be a Muslim there running a Holocaust center, still to this day. And the community in Riverdale, which is where we are, the Jewish community has been fine. I have great relationships with them. We have a Bengali and an Arab community of Muslims that are there, and also Christians and Presbyterians that are there. So we still have this interfaith clergy of Riverdale. So I'm one of those very fortunate people so far.
My center in Omaha is a regional partner of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they're doing these fantastic programs where they're spending 3 years within a region in the United States. So right now they're in what they're calling the Plains region, and we have these monthly meetings where colleagues who are not in our position, they may teach world history, and inside world history they'll teach the Holocaust. the ability for them to teach this subject has been minimized over the years through lack of funding. They may be the only historian at the college, or they may be the only literary scholar who teaches Holocaust literature. And these monthly meetings have been an eye-opener for me. So I would echo Manaz's comment that we are very, very fortunate, but many others are not. And we are going to see an eroding of Holocaust education on a lot of smaller campuses and with smaller universities with smaller budgets. So it's going to be a tremendous shame. But I will give props to the U.S. Holocaust Museum for doing this type of work, that they have the resources to go into these smaller campuses, smaller areas. They're not targeting the Yales and the Harvards of the world. They're finding these small liberal arts colleges in Iowa and Kansas and North Dakota and South Dakota and putting on programming there to help support that. So there is a network to help support what is happening, but I am still concerned of what is not happening in terms of Holocaust education in some of the campuses that have been most heavily hit.
Thank you all for your very interesting, inspiring remarks. I'm wondering, can you provide us any context to understand the world's reaction to October 7th and what's happened in the couple of years since then? Is it a genocide, and why do young people and the global community focus on this genocide much more than others? And is there something particular going on to explain this phenomenon? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk anymore without October 7th coming up, but I think what's happened is that the October 7th attack and Israel's response has really fueled the anger about basically colonization, but also the anger of seeing ourselves in the light of Palestinians versus Jews. And I'll tell you why that is. I think that the young people today feel very disempowered, which I can actually kind of understand, and really do not trust institutions at all. Capitalism, being rich, is the message, right? That's what makes you happy. So I think that, there's a responsibility that we have as adults, as parents, as mentors, to empower them in terms of how they think. The victimization of Palestinians has been going on for a long time. And so has the victimization of Jews in terms of anti-Semitism. However, we've ignored it over and over again. And Israel represents that kind of power. And I'm not saying that about all Israelis, please understand, but represents that colonial power that has a hold, in a way, and is supported by the United States, Europe, etc. So I think we're talking about a world order and the reaction to this world order that we've created. I also think that there is anti-Semitism globally. That's the second part. And that people are apt to blame Israel and Jews for more things. And I think that there is such a lack of understanding of why Israel needs to be a state. I don't know in what lines, that's not for me to decide, I'm not Palestinian, but that there needs to be a Jewish state has never been understood by the people. And that's also a problem with the way we educate students about Israel and Palestine and what's going on. And then the third level is that Israel and Jews are seen as white. They are not seen as indigenous or black, right? Or Arab or Japanese or Chinese. I mean, they're really seen as this white European colonial, just think of like the IDF uniform and the white man. And so I teach a lot about stereotypes, right? So this is a really big stereotype, and it's really hard to break when you see that war again. So I think that is what is fueling this protest against basically Israel seen as this white colonial country oppressing Palestinians. I don't know if that answered.
And this is going to have to be our last question, unfortunately.
Hi, very inspiring talk. Congratulations, everyone. It seems like a very interesting book, and I can't wait to read it. My question is, when you were putting this book together, and the question is to both of you, was there something that stood out to you, especially from the Muslim countries like Pakistan and Morocco, is how Holocaust is now in the contemporary sense understood and studied? And my other question is, what are your plans? Are you going to take the book kind of on the road and have some events in countries like Pakistan and Morocco, maybe in Saudi Arabia or UAE, to sort of make more room and space for global conversations around how we understand Holocaust and how people accept it and deny it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of take your question in a different direction, because I was going to highlight this specific chapter, because not everything in the book is about 1933 or 1940 or 1944 or 1945. Some of it is contemporary. And one of the chapters written by Navras Afridi, no relation, is about India and Pakistan and the Holocaust. And Afridi in this chapter explores how the Holocaust has been used by anti-Semites, by Islamophobes in India. There are those who revere Hitler and have called for a genocide against Muslims in India, for example. Again, these are the extremists, and I think a chapter like that creates a very interesting dynamic within Holocaust studies, that these symbols, the imagery, are still being used. They're being used in a very different way in politics, in the case here in India and in Pakistan and elsewhere, that for me are deeply, deeply troubling. This is not a subject that I'm overly familiar with, but Afridi does a very powerful job of calling our attention to the need for Holocaust education in places like India and elsewhere.
In terms of taking it on the road, I don't know, like if you guys want to fund us and we can go to Morocco, I'd love that. It would be a great trip. I could take some students. That would be just fantastic. And then we could go to, I don't know, Pakistan would be great. I'll be there next summer. Oh, I know, but we could, it would be a little dangerous, I think. Yes, and that's the problem, right? That there is a danger about this work outside of this context. And, my family is in Pakistan. I go there every 2 years with my daughter and my family. But, my mother does say, don't say too much about your work. And I think that's kind of frightening, right, in terms of your identity and who you are. And plus, for me, it's more about protection of my family more than anything else.
You mean in Pakistan? Or here? Or here too?
Thank you both. I feel like we could continue this conversation we have often, where we'll just go off, and we want to thank all of you for coming here. This is a moment of great global anxiety, and it's asking all of us to see each other's humanity, whether or not we like one another, and to recognize that when one of us is suffering, we are all suffering, and that many things can be conflicting and true at the same time. That's certainly why I do this work. And I want to thank you all, and on behalf of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, thank you all for tuning in. Be well, stay safe.
I just want to really thank Dr. Laura Cohen, for doing this and being here for us. I appreciate it, and the museum. Thank you, Sydney, for putting it together, and all of you to come out tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Okay, take care.